Hello everybody and welcome to today's Derivan Artist Talk. It's my great pleasure, I'm Stephen Patterson from Derivan, and it's my great pleasure to introduce a mate of mine, Andrew Totman, who originates from North California. Just a quick history, after gaining his BA at the University of San Diego, correct me if I get this wrong, and then achieving a Master of Fine Arts at Wichita State Uni. I keep getting that song in my head, the Wichita Linesman. Then moved to Australia about 15 years ago. Which is, I think, probably around the time I first met you, actually. And since moving to Australia, Andy's taught at Meadowbank TAFE, Hornsby, Enmore and Campbelltown TAFEs, as well as the National Art School, where Andy was actually the acting head of printmaking for a while. And now Andrew is currently the head of the School of Art and Design at TAFE New South Wales, the Riverina Institute. I want to see that on the door. So I'm going to hand over to Andy to entertain and enlighten you on printmaking and drawing and painting and all sorts of interesting things.
All those things.
All those things.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to show you a few things, and it's a brief history, sort of an overview of my past life and my current life. My background, as Stephen said, I started off as a drawing, painting, printmaker, and I learned the basics when I was at school and high school, and then at uni I actually learned to specialize dealing with more intense areas of study with etching, screen printing, and lithography. And at that point I was learning the process, and the process was a big part of what I was learning. It wasn't sort of getting too tied up in the imagery at that point. At that point, I tried to experiment with the process, pushing the boundaries of it, and see where it could take me. So what I did was set little goals for myself to do a series of drawings and a series of prints and a series of images that would sort of just continue along the way. So in 1 2-week period, I actually did 60 works. Then I had a 6-week course I did where I did 200 works. And I kept pushing that boundary within it, so I tried to force the image to alter itself. So at the beginning stages, my work were extremely strict, extremely precise, almost photorealistic, if you want to call it that. And so I used to spend 40, 50 hours a week on a drawing, and then I'd have 3 or 4 of those going, and just constantly work with it. I wanted to sort of lighten myself up. I wanted to push the boundaries of it so it became a little bit more softer around the edge. The image became a little bit more of a personalized image. So I took that, and that forcing of it to do those multiple images, mass amount of images in a short period of time, sort of saw that happen. So that time where I did that 6-week time period, I could see an image that started up over here and finished over here, and it actually changed along the way. It's almost like it morphed itself into a new image. So that image that was strong and crisp over here was sort of soft and meek on this side. And it wasn't sort of changing the image that much, but changing how it was sort of perceived. And so that I was dealing with that. But at the same time, I was dealing with drawing. And drawing is the backbone of everything I do within my teaching, everything I do within my artwork. And the human figure was something I dealt with a lot too. So at the same time I was doing all those prints, I was doing still life drawings and life drawings with the figure. And I was spending time doing that, being as realistic as possible, as sort of precise as possible with that. So I was abstracting myself in a way, and I was actually refining myself at the same time, and it sort of became a nice mix of everything that was happening within it. The image that I dealt with as the life drawing, I was dealing with live models, and that's something I hadn't done before I went to San Diego. But along with that, I was actually taking anatomy courses, not as the medicine side of things, but it was actually with pre-med students, but we were actually dealing with cadavers at the same time. So we were actually carving into these bodies, and I was drawing them at the same time. So I could see what sort of started things off. And I always tell students today, if you have an apple, cut it open and see what's inside, and then you can draw the outside better. Same thing with the body. When you see what actually holds everything together, you're able to draw those lines a little bit more crisper, a little bit clearer, and you know what actually holds everything together. So those were things I dealt with, and I played with them, but it's something that you have to continue to deal with as a life drawing situation. If you don't stay on top of it, you lose it quick. It comes back, but you have to keep on top of it. So dealing with the inside form and the inside structure, dealing with that form to see what was inside, but then drawing it at the same time. So as I was carving into it, you actually see what was holding it together and learning exactly what the bones, muscles, and everything else, all the ligaments were actually doing. Not just memorizing the names, which we did have to memorize all those names as well, but learned what they did. And so the pulley system and everything that was working within that. Most of these actually were never shown per se. They were never shown in exhibits. They were more just practice images, learning how to draw, learning how to be almost like an architect in a way. And those were taken another way into my other images. I always tell people that an abstract line is the same line just put together differently, or it's the same sentence but just said with a little different accent to it. So they have a different play within it. The images were things, again, it was time, it was a struggle. Every day was something that you had to be on top of your game. When you weren't feeling like doing it, it just didn't work. So not everyone was successful. There was a lot of things were thrown away along the way. I'm sort of jumping ahead quite a bit, but after San Diego, I went on to Wichita State University, as Stephen said, and I chose that school for a couple different reasons. One of the main one was the professor I studied with in San Diego was very close mates with his friend in Kansas, and I was sort of introduced to his style and his images along the way. And color was something that this professor dealt with, and I wanted to learn how to deal with color within my prints. Color printmaking was something that was done, but it was not done everywhere, and it was not done with every process. So some areas were more colorful than others. Being purely an etcher at that point, color was not really a big part of it, and the teachers I was studying with in San Diego didn't have the background to deal with that. So I went on and I was doing my master's, and color is why I went there. But on top of that, I was able to teach while I was there. So that was another thing. I always knew I needed sort of a career path, and teaching was something I wanted to deal with. So the color was something that was sort of pushed upon us from day one, and it was a way that we could grasp how to be a little bit more painterly within our images and to be a little bit more bold within our mark making. And it was a fantastic course. It was a fantastic way to get caught up into the images and to learn different techniques, multiple plate techniques, color relief techniques, cardboard cutout techniques, or cardboard plate cutout techniques. So lots of different ways that we learned how to deal with color, and we learned how to deal with color with paper making and cast paper making as well. So those are things I still deal with today, and just starting to develop a paper making area within the school I'm teaching at right now. After Kansas, teaching again was what I wanted to do, so I was looking around, and jobs, as jobs go, you take what you can get, and I actually got a very nice job, but it happened to be in Alaska. And so my first teaching position was at the University of Alaska in Anchorage. And it was a beautiful place. Happened to walk into a situation where it was a brand new facility. They had just built this brand new building. So I had pristine print equipment that had never been touched before. Someone else had already done all the ordering on it, so I just walked in the door and just set up shop. I was there for about 3.5 years, dealt with it in quite a good way. We actually built the strongest numbers that they still have had there today. And it was a fun place to be. It was a beautiful location. We had a panoramic view of a mountain range, and we used to have moose going through our parking lot every day. So it was a beautiful place to be. Cold, but beautiful. Like any place else, an artist's studio is sort of like their sort of mad scientist's workshop, and it doesn't matter where you are. It could be in Paris, it could be in Rome, it could be in Sydney. When you're an artist, you're basically sort of in your studio, and you sort of get tied up into that moment of being in the studio, and so you don't look out the window that often. So it was a great time to get a lot of work done, and with the short days during winter, it was a good time to stay indoors too. And so I did a lot of work. At that point is where I sort of set these goals for myself. I set a goal for myself to create 100 new images each year. And so that's something I still try to stay on top of today. I try to keep that as a standard for myself, and if I can reach that, fantastic. I don't throw a party, but I actually just sort of keep that going as much as I can. And when I don't get there, I sort of look back and see what was my obstacle along the way and see where I could have gone different directions within that. In this time in Alaska, though, I also pushed the boundaries of the media itself. So printmakers are sort of restricted by the plate, they're restricted by the press, and they're restricted by the size of their studio. I had a huge studio at that time. We had some big presses, but there's still a boundary. So the table that's in front of me right now might be the biggest plate that you can get for what I was working in. And I had presses that could print that big, but I wanted to go even larger. So I started dealing with multiple size panels and assembling them together. So within this, it's 36 panels to create one large print. Additioning that was hard, but it was something that I was able to push those boundaries within that. Dealing with color, dealing with black and white, dealing with white on black, so white ink on black paper, and specializing in just sort of stylizing my image at the same time. These images starting to become more of a persona than myself. They were actually sort of this idea of what I wanted the image to be. But they were still started to become recognized of like these images of Andy, things like that. And they almost became almost like stage-like at the same time. So I played up that aspect of it. They almost had this theatrical feel to them. Along this time, I actually started doing some set designs for the theater company in town. And that was actually another way to deal with images, another way to deal with the scale of the images, and another way to sort of introduce myself to a different crowd of people. And I always try to do that within my work still today, is that I like to create an image, but it has an action or a reaction with other walks of life, basically. And so the theater crowd or the set designers and things like that was something I might have done just playing with it in the high school, but this was something on a full-scale venture, and it was dealing with the right way of doing it, and so I learned how to deal with that. Later I did images that were dealing with sort of some targets and sort of like almost like a violent side of the things, but not being violent. But I actually dealt with different things dealing with mugshots and police sketches and things like that. So introducing myself or involving myself in different things to sort of keep it all new to me. And that was what I was trying to do. I always try to think of hitting as many different ways of thinking to enhance the work along the way. After Alaska, I moved on to California, where I was teaching at UCLA and Otis Art Institute. And I normally say at this time I was more of an artist than a teacher. Now I'm more of a teacher than an artist in some ways. And I was trying to prove myself as being an artist. And it was hard, it was tough, challenging. At that point, I was working with about 36 different galleries, and it was more of a headache than a heart situation at that point, because I was so much into dealing with all those contacts and commitments and all that it sort of drove me apart from dealing with the making of the artwork. So that time where you were locked away in the studio, you actually were dealing more with the business side of things, and that's something that's hard to deal with. But I changed the direction of my images a little bit and sort of wanted to become a little bit more three-dimensional. I always felt that the structure of the plates, I viewed them as a landscape, looking at a metal plate side on, looking at a screen at an angle or whatever. Those plates became like these landscapes along the way, and you can see the valleys and the peaks along those plates. So I always felt the natural progression for a lot of printmakers was three-dimensional. So I started dealing with these folded shapes. These images that actually were flat became a folded image. So the plates were actually textural, became flat, then became 3D again, and giving it life in a different way. They were fun to deal with. I dealt with squares, shapes, freestanding images, things that were actually sort of floating in the galleries and all. But there were different ways of dealing with, and time conceived in a different way too. The image was something that was important, but actually the folding of it was probably a little bit more important. So it was that actual shape that I was dealing with. I started dealing with more and more color at that point too. The color was something that when I was in Kansas, it was very bold and very bright, but the image was sort of more cartoonish in a way. When I went to Kansas, it altered a little bit. When I went to Alaska, it changed a little bit more. And when I came to Los Angeles, it became a little different entity altogether again. I started dealing with images that were more playful, a little bit more childlike, a little bit more of a imaginative sort of quality within themselves. It's probably about the same time where I became a father. So those are things that I was dealing with. But it was something that changed within my work sort of naturally along the way. Every time I live in a different location, a different country, a different sort of city, everyone says, does that affect me along the way? And I used to always say, no, it doesn't affect me, it doesn't affect me. And nowadays, everything has sort of come together and sort of changed things along the way. When I was in Los Angeles also, I started dealing with a framer that was actually framing up my images to sort of follow the shapes and the boundaries of the plates I was dealing with. So if I had a peaked roof sort of image within my prints, I would find a frame that went with that, or they actually made them specially designed for that. The images themselves, they were marketable. They were something that were sellable. They were extremely playful, but I always wanted to go a little bit different direction with them. I was always sort of striving for something a little bit more. When I moved to Australia in about '96, I found my images were a little bit too colorful for Australia. When I first started working at the National Art School, I got there and I opened up the cupboards and there was black ink. That was it. There was black ink. And I used to actually bring colored cans of ink back from the States every time I would fly over with me to replenish the supplies, because they just weren't on the market here at that time. And it wasn't that long ago, but there just wasn't a lot of colored inks that were happening at that point. There were places in the States that were quite plentiful with colors, and different printmaking markets were very drastic with color. But it's just something that wasn't a big part of the scheme. And the purest printmakers were black and white printmakers, and that's sort of the nature of the beast. I fought that for a while, and then I always told my students I always dealt with the black image first, and then it became a colorful image later. I always said I didn't want to sort of fool the public with color. I wanted to make sure it worked as a black and white. If it wasn't successful as a black and white, it was not going to work as a colorful image. So I sort of took that on note and started doing series of works that were purely black and white. And so this was one of the first ones, probably about 97, 98, I started dealing with this image. And it became a little bit less figurative. It was dealing with objects. It's not abstract by any means, but it's an object-based image and being black. I sort of stepped back from some of the image and stepped back into dealing with the process. I got more into the creation of the image, creation of the plate, and I sort of knew at that point what it was going to look like before I even printed it, and most printmakers can say that they know what it's going to look like. You know what that is going to look like before you do it, and then you know what the time frame is going to be within that too. So I got involved with loving again the practice of making the prints. And that was something that I think I was probably missing sometimes when I was in Los Angeles. I was missing that time just being in the studio, just enjoying that time. Just enjoying the time where I was actually utilizing fully the time in the studio. And sometimes you lose that time. But the black and white image sort of turned the light on inside me and turned the light on in some of my market also. It closed some of the markets as well, because it was a different way of thinking. I went overseas back to a place where I used to show quite a bit on the West Coast, and some people had bought my work many times in the past, saw the new images and said, what happened? What, did you go through a midlife crisis or something? But it just was a change, and they actually saw that almost as a break in reality. They thought I had sort of scorned them in a way. But it was just a new way of thinking, a new image, and they learned to love it later on. but it was a different way of dealing with the prints. While I was in LA, I actually went on a residency in Venezuela, in Maracaibo, and I learned how to deal with images from a new location. When I moved to Australia, I connected to a space that was in China, and I did some workshops with a place called the Pickle Art Center, and then I did a residency there. And then I did a residency with the Sunshine Museum, which is an image of right here. I started dealing with traveling more and more so, and I did this when I went to Venezuela. I've done this when I was in France, when I was in Italy, and all those different places. But I learned how to deal with things that were maybe not full force, meaning the studios I had to make do with what I had. So when I first started traveling to China, I started doing a lot of ink images, just paintings on paper. They looked like prints, but they were ink washes, they were ink drops, ink scribbles, or whatever I was dealing with. But they had a print feel to it, but they were actually one-off images. Then I found the press that was there, and I was able to do images that were dealing with the printing press. But that's all they had was a printing press, so I was doing monoprints and monotypes. So I started stylizing my work that would be able to meet the needs of the equipment that I had on hand. These are just some shots of the Sunshine Museum. But those images became something I actually was quite proud of, quite interested in, because it was taking me in a new direction. It was taking some of the process away, but the mark making, the act of the mark, was something I was actually dealing with. One time, early on in the first couple of times going to China, my wife and I were walking through Beihai Park, just next to the Forbidden City. And there was a man with a mop and a bucket of water. And he was dunking the mop into this bucket of water and drawing these Chinese characters on the ground. And it was a hot summer day, and they would just evaporate. And I asked my wife what they said. And basically she said, it's coming from nothing and becoming nothing again. So the image was there and disappeared. They were political statements, but there was no repercussions from those political statements because they just disappeared. So he could say anything he wanted to on these marks, and they just died, and they just disappeared as a whisper in a way. And I found that sort of clicked something in my mind. The images I was dealing with, at one point, I was laying down all these washes, all these marks onto the plates, and sometimes they were marks that just disappeared. I made them. They didn't actually make a mark afterwards. They just were so light and so faint. But the multitude of them on top of each other actually made a difference and made a mark. But that one single mark didn't really make a difference at all. But it was the mark or the action of that mark or the movement that I was actually going through, almost like a meditational movement in a way, almost like Tai Chi. Not that I do Tai Chi, but it's something like that again. And so that mark actually created something and meant something to me. So the making of it sort of was what it was all about. And then the end result was something that was, again, I was happy with, but it didn't have as much of a meaning to it. I hope it has a meaning to the public, though. So these are some of the layer effects I was dealing with. So these are actually dealing with multiple plates. They're dealing with a mix of techniques. I started throwing a few techniques I'd never dealt with before. These are dealing with spit bites. These are dealing with soap washes and resists. And so multiple plates, but giving the fact or the look that there's even more plates involved. So there's 2 plates, but each plate probably had been in acid maybe 40 or 50 times. So it's layer upon layer upon layer. And when they layered up, if you saw this in front of you, it'd almost be like you could grab inside of it. And it gives that sort of optical illusion within it. They're still not abstract to me. They're still sort of marks that are shapes. So they're not pure abstract by any means, but there's more of a caricature of a mark. And there's sort of more of a statement or a personalization of that mark. This is the lithograph, but it's dealing again with a layer effect. And I always tell students that the sign of a strong print is something that gives something the illusion that it has a depth of field to it. It is a flat surface, the papers are flat, there's no texture to it at all, but it gives the illusion that there's more to it than what is there in front of you. Also, I like to fool the public in a way that they might not know how that was created. When I show works to galleries, generally, I don't give them the process all the time. If it looks like a painting, it might be a painting. If it looks like a print, it might be a painting. You never know what it might be. Again, layering things up. About this time I started dealing with, and this is here in Australia, about this time I started dealing with limiting my color palette a little bit. I was still doing some colorful images, still doing some black and white pieces, but I started doing a series of works dealing with two colors. And this is a sanguine and a Payne's gray. And so with those two colors, I've probably done hundreds of prints now that just utilize those two colors and just show how it will react differently, how that will change the image, how those color combinations will change how it ends up looking as well. So some of that can be very crisp, some of them can be very bright, some of them can be very moody. Just playing with those color aspects along the way. Again, dealing with color techniques and color printmaking processes too. Printmaking is something that I started off doing aquatints a lot. Aquatint is a textural technique that is dealt with in printmaking. I was used to identify an aquatint as being like a poor man's mezzotint. And an aquatint is something where you create a tone. Goya would probably be one of the first artists and printmakers who was dealing with it in their own right as a technical ability to create an artwork. Before that, it was probably utilized to reproduce images of other artworks, almost like a photocopy for now. It was copying other artworks along the way. So Goya sort of took it and made it his own image and dealt with his images. In the Disaster of War series, if you know those images, it was used quite thoroughly throughout that. But those techniques, I played and forced and altered them along the way. I did have an exposure to mezzotints when I was in graduate school. I did quite a few of them playing with it. But it was something that I probably didn't take to full advantage of. I always used to tell people I didn't trust anyone doing prints, doing abstraction in their work too early in life. I didn't trust myself doing it too early in life. I didn't trust myself doing mezzotints too early in life. So just recently I started getting into it and sort of felt that I was capable enough to deal with the image and the media to sort of give it true just to it. Something that I had to be comfortable with what I was doing, and that's something I had to play with. These images are monotypes and monoprints, dealing with a stylized aquatint, a stylized mezzotint technique, but through a monoprint or a monotype, meaning they're one-off situations, they're one-off prints. But it was at this time that I started reinvestigating the mezzotint. A mezzotint is a technique where you actually, it's a dry point technique, there's no acid involved. You actually manipulate the plate by hand using a metal rocker like this. This is a mezzotint rocker. And you actually roll it across the plate so it embeds or presses these teeth into the plate. In every which way or every direction possible, you press that in. So if you print it up, it prints black, like velvet. And then you come back and you burnish or erase marks within the plate to create your highlights. And so I started doing that with my monotypes and monoprints, those one-off situations. Then recently, that's a new series of works I'm working on, dealing mezzotints. So I can do those anywhere. I still need a press to do them, but I could do them, you know, if I was a passenger in the car, I could actually be working on them. If I was traveling on the plane somewhere, I could be burnishing them, if they allowed that on the plane. But those are things I can do any place, any side. If I have an extra 5 minutes of time in my life, sometimes I do, and I can actually work on those. And it's something that you don't need acid, and so you don't need every chemical in the world to deal with, and so I was wanting to deal with that lately. The reason for that is that I'm wanting to take these images and turn them into something that can be additioned, something that can have a multiple to it. I've found along the way that initially my prints were very, very small additions, And then I pushed my edition size to deal with the galleries I was dealing with. And nowadays I'm not dealing with nearly as many galleries, but I find that the edition is something I don't want to waste my time and just do one image or 2 or 3 or 10. I want to push the boundaries of that so I have larger editions, can reach more of a market, but then have a more longevity for that image too. So if it's not going to disappear or sell out if I only have 3 of them, I'll have many more of those to be able to reproduce within the market. I might just go back to that one. I'm going to talk just briefly about mezzotints, and again, it's something that I'm dealing with more so nowadays. It's something that is not for everyone, and some of the processes I deal with probably scare some people away because they're so process oriented, even though when I teach the processes, I take it back as to the bare bones, so I'm not scaring people away with it, because printmaking can push people away. But the mezzotint is something that I enjoy that process. I enjoy those steps that you go through. Some people describe it like cooking. There's a recipe you can follow, and every time, if you change that recipe subtly, it will be a new image. And it's something I enjoy that. Every time I'm cooking with my plates, there's something that is new coming to life within that. So the plates themselves, after you use the mezzotint rocker on it, mezzo basically in Italian meaning half. It's a half moon or a half shape or a half mark going into that plate. So it's not going deep down into it, it's just a shallow mark, just barely indenting into that mark into the plate itself. So if you had the plates themselves, they're purely mezzotinted or rocked thoroughly. Again, they print like velvet. They're beautiful images just by themselves. It's time. So these plates, the small ones, something about this size, might take a week to do the rocking of them. Larger plates, now that I'm starting to deal with, I'm actually purchasing some of them that have been pre-mezzotinted. You can buy them pre-mezzotinted by man, a man that actually is rocking them and you buy them, or else you can buy one that's done by a machine. And the machine ones are probably not as thorough and not as sort of delicate of an image. The hand ones are a little bit more lush. When you do them by yourselves, or the whole process along the way, that's something that you understand and you're sort of more ingrained and sort of connected to the plate when you're doing it yourself. But it's time. If you want to really do it and want to do many of them, I don't have the time to do all the rocking myself. It's beyond me. But you come back and draw back into it. Afterwards, after the plate has been mezzotinted or rocked, you come back with a burnisher, like a metal object like this, and you erase where you actually burnished or where you scratched into it before. So those become highlights. Those become the light areas within the plate. So something that's shiny has been burnished. Something that's dull and sort of flat looking is where it's a pure mezzotinted plate. And when you start printing those, the light areas are the white of the page, or the lighter color coming through in the background. The deeper areas are where you're going to have the basic bulk of the color coming through it. And layering them up, dealing with multiple plates, dealing with multiple layers of colors, or dealing with registration that's going to allow for all those variants to come through is what you play with. Not sure how they're going to show up within the image on the screen or not. But so those 2 plates right there are these prints here. So they layer up on top of each other. Again, these are the same 2 colors I was using earlier, the sanguine and the Payne's gray, layered up in a different way to create a nuance of an image. So with these plates, you can print the same image over and over and over again. You can alter the color combination, so the sanguine plate could become the Payne's gray plate, and you can switch those around. Which one is printed first or second will change how the image will look as well. So the layering of everything depicts how it goes through, the pressure that you're using going through the press. How much you soak your paper or how wet your paper is when you're going through the press will change the effect of the print as well. The longevity of the plates is quite long. If you take care of these, they'll last for hundreds of prints. You would not want to do this on a zinc plate. Zinc plates would wear down too fast. So a copper plate is a necessity for these to work and for them to have a longevity within it. Again, multitude of color combinations too, so I can print this in a variety of different colors and have a totally different look and feel within the image itself. So these are things that are almost like, I guess they're my toy that I'm dealing with now. I'm playing with them, I'm altering them, doing as many different shapes and qualities within it. This last break I had from teaching, I was in the studio and I probably did 120 images that were all different color combinations I was dealing with. And just playing with how that comes through it. And it was always a nice feeling. It's almost like a little surprise every time you pull the blanket away and see what's coming over the other side. Someone's described them as being almost like candy-like or lolly-like, in that every time there's a new color combination, they sort of have a different feel within it. They have that fabric sort of feel to it too, and they sort of have a feel of texture, but they're still flat. And I'm sort of pushing the boundaries of those within that too. So that's the new direction I'm dealing with, those mesotints, and a show I'm having in December and then a show I'm having in January are all dealing with those new series along the way. I continually go back to the color aspect of things. I still play with that because it's something I might, every week or month I might come back and do one of those to see how I'm dealing with it differently. And it's almost like knocking on the door of an old friend, seeing what is going to happen that day with that image. And it's something I feel so comfortable with that I know again how it's going to look, where some of these are still those nuances and those new things that are sort of like a new friend in a way that you don't know how things are going to react all the time. So you sort of get surprised sometimes. And that's something I probably need within my prints. I need that surprise. I never like to stay with one of those processes too long. I always sort of go and change it and come back to something else. So it always keeps that nuance alive. Anyway, I might say if there's any questions.
I just want to go back to beginning, you were
Yep.
talking about explain what you were saying you're working with cast paper.
Cast paper, yep.
Yeah.
So that was something, it was probably had a trendy quality to it at the time, so this is probably the mid-'80s. Cast paper is something where you actually make a clay, a mold out of clay, and you mix whatever you want, you make whatever shapes you want to do. Generally, they were like a low relief sculpture in a way, and then you poured plaster on top of that, so it became a plaster sculpture in a way, and then you pressed paper pulp into it, and you're pressing the paper pulp into that plaster mold. No, it's dry plaster, and you're pressing wet paper pulp into that as firmly as you possibly can, so it's getting into all the nooks and crannies. And then as that dries, it pulls away and becomes a freestanding object of that plaster, which was what the clay looked like to start with. And then you can make an addition of that. I don't have any images of that on this slide set, but basically they became rock hard when they're dry. You can paint them, you can stain them, you can put a gloss varnish on top of that.
So you're not making, like in my class, you're making paper to print on, the actual paper is your print.
No, the print is, the cast paper piece is the artwork.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
But I was using recycled paper at that point to make those molds also. So the paper pulp I was pushing in to make the final object was old prints I had torn up of myself, of staff members or professors that I was dealing with. And so they had color flecks of old images coming through it. There might be a little red from this print, a little blue from that print. And then sometimes I left that so it became part of the image, so it almost had like this oatmeal sort of quality or porridge sort of look to it. Or sometimes I'd paint them so they have acrylic paints going on top of it, or a clear varnish, or sometimes just a white. So it actually became a drastic image with the lighting coming across it. That's something, it's quite fun because they have, sometimes you can't get too perfect with them. They have a sort of a rough quality to it, and that's what I liked about them. You could never become so proficient with it that it was going to be sort of too clean. And some of my images have that sort of tendency to become too clean. So that was a sort of a rough thing that worked as a balance within it. And then I could make them freestanding, which prints were something that were not freestanding at that time. And that's when I started dealing with those folded images. There's an artist, Red Grooms, and he did an image of cast paper pieces, then folded paper pieces. And he did like the size of this room, a series of a subway in New York, but they're all paper pieces, they're life size, and so dealing with that kind of stuff. Can't think of who else was dealing with that, but quite a few different artists were dealing with that at that time. It's a lot of work, especially just even pressing that paper into those molds is something that was time consuming. And like I said earlier today, was that we're just about to start at my institute a paper making program. So it's something sort of going full circle. It's sort of old school stuff. It's very hands-on, very sort of crafty in a way, but you can make beautiful sheets of paper that, for a printmaker, you can make the paper, do the print, and so every aspect of it is you. And then I like the aspect too of, you always have paper that you're tearing off or edges that you're tearing off. Instead of letting it go to waste, you recycle that and make your own. A friend of mine, when I was in graduate school, his father actually passed away at that point, and he used all of his old t-shirts and tore them up and made paper out of them. So you can make out of cloth. These are cotton sheets. These are actually 100% cotton. So you can use anything you want. Old Levi's, old denim makes a beautiful sheet of paper. It's hard to beat up into a pulp, but they're beautiful things, and the color is fantastic when it dries and sets. So anything that you dealt with, handmade papers, or you can use recycled things, or you can use found objects or natural objects, so weeds, reeds, bamboo, anything like that can be utilized again. There's a place in town that does recycled papers with found objects and embedding seeds into their papers. So you can actually plant that paper afterwards and it will sprout. So there's lots of things you can do with it. It's a fun thing to do, and it's a craft, but then it works well for an art. Sometimes it gets a little bit too crafty though. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask if you could clarify that the aquatint.
Yeah. An aquatint is, a traditional aquatint is using a powdered resin or rosin. It's like a tree sap, and it's what violinists use to rosin their bows. Boxers use it to get a better footing. They step on it before they go into the ring, or gymnasts use it to hold on to the balance beams and things like that. So that's in a dust form. And so you get that in that dust form, and you put it into a box which is called an aquatint box. And you crank up that box, and it blows that dust all up into the sky, into this box, and it falls down gradually on top of your plate. So what happens is it actually creates a dust across the plate, and then you melt that onto the surface of the plate, so those powdered dots that are on the plate become a resist. So there's a dot pattern. There's an open area, dot, open area, dot. So if you do it correctly, there's 50% open area, 50% covered by the powdered resin. And then you etch that into the acid. So where the resist is white, where the open area is dark, and that's where, let's say, half tones would come from, a gray scale would come from. Anything that's used in any commercial type of printing, that's where it all started. And that would be basically the start of where photography would have started too. So from that technology, it went into a photographic situation. You can create tones. So if it's in the acid for 5 minutes, it's probably going to be black. If it's in the acid for 10 seconds, it's going to be a very light gray. If it was never etched at all, it's going to print white. So you can have from white to black in every variation along the way if you do it correctly. Nowadays, there's other ways you can do it. You can use spray paint. You can use an airbrush and use a water-based medium to spray across the plate. You can just blow a substance through a straw and blow that onto the plate and have it sort of be in a sparse area. You can take an old toothbrush and just flick it onto it. Anything that you want to do that is going to create a substance that's going to be a dot pattern onto the plate is basically an aquatint. The true sense of the meaning is using the resin or rosin, but it can be done in different ways. And it's hard. It's sort of, I liken it to sort of mixing art and chemistry. And it's something that you have to deal with control of your acid, control of your times, control of your sort of your record keeping. It's a hard thing for students to do because I always tell, how long was that in the acid for? How long did you put that in? Come back and show me on your notes where you were. So that line was how long, that aquatint was how long. And those are things that it's hard for them to do, but once they get it adjusted to it, they can do it quite well, and it's a beautiful thing to do. The first prints that I sort of did that I knew I was on track was an aquatint, and it was very simple, but it was something that I just got right, and it probably got right early, so I didn't have to struggle with it. But then it just gave me that confidence to keep going with it. And it's something that they're beautiful, they have a great tone to it, and they have a great sort of depth of field to it. And it's pushing that boundary again. Yeah, yeah, go ahead. That's okay. Yeah.
Printmaking, but I'd just love to know what is the difference between a monoprint and a monotype print? Like what's...
Okay. Most people, and I mean, I would say 10 years ago, most people just called them monoprints, and that was it. A monotype is going to be something that is more or less a one-off. There's no chance of it being reproduced or recreated in any way, shape, or form. There's not a matrix or a substance that's going to be able to be adapted again and again by anyone. So if I'm doing the print and you're doing the print, there's nothing that's going to let it be the same. Our marks are going to be different. A monoprint itself is going to have something that's going to be a structure that's going to give it something, the ability to be reproduced. So let's say if I have a 2-plate print, that's a monoprint. One of them is going to have maybe a line or a ground or a texture that's on it. It might be a stamp of a number 2. So the number 2 is something that's going to be tangible, that be able to be reproduced again and again and again. That's called a matrix, something that has something of substance that you're going to be able to deal with. And that's probably the biggest, easiest way to define the two of them. Most people don't identify it correctly. Most people don't care if it's identified correctly. A one-of-a-kind is probably the easiest thing to do, or a one-off image. But to a purist, they're going to fight you to the end of which one is which. And some people will always still say one is one and one the other. And worldwide, it has different meanings, I would say. Yeah. So that would be what is normally happening today in Australia would be that definition. Okay. Sure. The one thing that I touched briefly on was a dry point technique, and so a mezzotint is a dry point technique. Dry point is anything that's not using acid. Okay. So earlier today you talked about a dry point on acetate. So not using acid, dry point. If dry point on metal plate, if it's a mezzotint monoprint, all those are dry point. There's nothing that's going to be a water-based or acid-based situation. And engraving is a dry point also. And engraving is where you're actually carving away pieces of the metal. It's an old school technique that not a lot of people are using. It's very difficult to do. Anything that is an etching is using acid. So generally it's done on copper or zinc, sometimes aluminium, sometimes steel, different metals, but generally copper or zinc. And generally if it's using copper, it's hydrochloric acid. If it's using zinc, it's nitric acid. And other things can be utilized as well. It's also called an intaglio print. And intaglio is anything that's having a lowered surface to it generally. And so, but different things along the way. Mezzotints I didn't talk about. Not one of the oldest techniques, 1642. Etchings were back to 1500. Then the first press was 1454. So it's been around for a long time doing different print techniques. Yeah. And there's new ones every day coming into the play. Yeah. Okay. I might just say thank you, and thanks for having me, and thanks for being here, and enjoy.
Thank you.
Okay.